In this video, I'm just going to go over what some of these general things are and what they mean in every TAPR report that you download. So with each TAPR, you're going to see whether or not they actually met the standard. And that meeting standard is a combination of lots of things that they look at. There's very complicated formulas. And if you're really interested, you can download those off the TEA website on whether or not the district has met the standard or didn't meet standard. And now we have, A, B, C, or D, or F. And those are also very complicated ratings as well. We also have distinction designations. If they received it, you might not always see these on TAPR reports, and you won't see them if they didn't achieve it. And so one of them are, you might see an academic achievement, which just means they had outstanding performance in these areas. And so we see that they got it in ELA reading, math, and science, and not in history. You also might see one of these things, top 25% in comparative closing the gaps, or you might see a top 25% in student academic growth, and then post-secondary readiness. And so what the closing gaps looks at is they look at what that racial and ethnic, because for a long time we've seen a disparity in, let's say, white to black or white to Hispanic as far as achievement goes. And so this particular campus has done a very good job of closing the achievement gap among racial and ethnic groups. You might also see top 25% in student academic growth. And basically what that means is that the state is looking at how much growth is happening from year to year with that particular student group. And so you might see that they've done a really good job of exceeding what was expected as far as academic growth from year to year. And then post-secondary readiness is just a strong score in what we see as far as, are they ready to move on with career, college, or military readiness? Some of the other things that you're going to see the same across, which is kind of interesting in reporting, let me come down, is right here. Here's where we get that school progress. Again, when we compare students compare the same student from one year to the next, the state measures how much growth was expected. And so it shows even a line about how much growth that student actually had. And so it could be accelerated growth, it could be flat growth, or it could have been decreased growth in what they expected that student to see from let's say the third grade to the fourth grade reading test or math test. And so that's what these new numbers are, is how much growth was actually there for those particular students taking these tests. Okay, so the Student Success Initiative is how many students maybe didn't pass the STAR test from one year, and then what happened the next year. And so we're hoping that students will pass the test the next year. We do know that, there's kind of those stops where you have fifth grade. If you don't pass the test the first time, you have to take it a second time, and then maybe a third time. And if you don't pass it on any of those administrations, you might be held back. That same thing happens in eighth grade, and the same thing happens with those EOCs. And so that's part of that Student Success Initiative. What we also see, which is kind of new, which is also very interesting, is in the previous ones, we saw previous performance report broken down by race and special populations. One of those special pops was ELLs, which is English language learners. And these next pages break it down by the type of program they're in, which is really neat. So bilingual ed, this means early exit, so they came out of bilingual education early, or they had to stay in a little bit longer. And in 2301, I go over what those differences are between ESL and bilingual programs, and also the traditional amount of time that's spent in bilingual education, and the differences between two-way and one-way. So basically in a two-way, that means you have an English language learner and maybe another language learner in the classroom. A one-way just means that you have all of the same types of language in the same classroom. And so then it breaks it down by ESL. So pull out, or no services, with services, content. And so that's also new this year. The other thing that it's going to report that I want to pull down is, it breaks it down also by how many students were, oh, right here, I just missed it, promoted to ninth grade, even though they didn't necessarily pass the test. So in some of the other reports, you'll see that, okay, maybe that student failed that test 3 times. Well, what happens when they fail the test 3 times is a committee will get together and decide whether or not those students are going to go ahead and be promoted to the next grade level anyway. And so in this case, we see that 88% were promoted to ninth grade, even though they failed that STAR test 3 times. And so where we typically see this is maybe a student who is in special education or maybe an economically disadvantaged, or maybe an English language learner, because those students most often are still having to take the STAR test regardless, which is also a difference than what we used to see with the TAKS test. And so that's what all of these kind of met standard or non-proficient in previous years, and it looks a little different on the elementary and the middle school assessment tests. I think that kind of covers what those big overall things are. I guess let me touch on one other thing, the attendance rate. Let's see, right here. Okay, so the attendance rate is really, 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 really important because it's tied directly into funding. And so what they do with funding is they look at your attendance rate, and your attendance rate is calculated by 6 weeks or 9 weeks. So it's going to say, okay, here's a snapshot. Here's the average of students who are present for this 9 weeks, and then this 9 weeks, and then this 9 weeks, and then this 9 weeks. And it's going to put all that together, and it's going to say, okay, 97% of African Americans were in attendance for that school year. And that's really important because instead of looking just at your raw number, it's for funding, they look at your average attendance rate and use that for funding. So that's why there's such a strong push to make sure that students are present every day.